Leopard geckos are the most popular pet lizard in the entire world, and this is everything you need to know to take care of one yourself. This is Littlefoot. Littlefoot is the very first reptile I ever produced way back in the day when I started to breed reptiles myself. And this is her dad, Cheech. I love leopard geckos. I've been keeping them for close to 20 years, and I never get bored of them. Leopard geckos are for almost everybody. They are a ephemeral species. Most people will tell you they're nocturnal or even crepuscular, meaning they're out during the night, or crepuscular, meaning dawn and dusk, but ephemeral. That means basically what self-employed people are. Just they're up whenever, doing stuff whenever. With that said, most of mine sleep mostly during the day. They'll come out for a little bit in the afternoon, and in the morning, usually they're already in bed. So pretty close to crepuscular. I'm gonna do my best through 6 categories to tell you everything you need to know, but of course, do more research than just watching some bald guy in his basement talk about his pet geckos. The Eublepharis macularis, which is the species of leopard gecko you're probably going to be having in captivity. There's a bunch of different species that come from Iraq, Iran, Pakistan, India, all over the place in this region here, but you want to know the size. That's the most important thing when you get any pet. How big does it get when it's an adult? Because when it's a baby, it's pretty small. But as an adult, they're going to get, well, not that big. Usually 7 to 8 inches. Keep in mind, this is an average. There are going to be bigger males. I've got some really big males and smaller females, or even bigger females and smaller males. But as a rule, males will get a bit bigger, about 10% bigger than females. And there are giant varieties too. So giant leopard geckos we're not really going to talk about, but they get enormous. And they're almost always going to be under 100 grams. So this one is on my back now. She's on my shoulder. I only noticed that because I looked at the monitor. You can barely feel them because they are so light, so be careful. Next, let's talk about the enclosure that you'll need, not just the size, but what you need to put in it. What's interesting with leopard geckos, as we evolve with care, when I first started making videos, it was 10 gallons. Keep them in 10 gallons and they're fine. This is too small now. So if somebody tells you at a pet store or on a forum, check the year. If it's 2009, stop reading. We've really advanced since then. Then we advanced to 20 gallons, and that was pretty much common standard until, I don't know, 2019, 2018 maybe. But I think what's best is where we're at now, which is about 40 gallons. Generally, I keep mine in 3 foot by 18 inch enclosures that are about 1 foot or 1.5 feet tall. Now there are some exceptions, which we'll get to closer to the end of the video, but I think this is the perfect size. You could go with a 40-gallon breeder with these dimensions here, but I would say this is probably the most optimal size, and that's what you're looking for. You can go front opening, which I recommend. It's just easier in every stretch, every single way it's easier. Plus, when you go from the top of a leopard gecko, it simulates prey, and they might be a little bit afraid of that. You're better off coming kind of underneath them, in front of them. For substrate, a lot of people will tell you to use paper towel or butcher paper, which you absolutely can. Don't use reptile carpet. It's absolute trash product. Cheech, my oldest leopard gecko, I remember I was late for a flight. I went downstairs to check on the animals. I only had 3 back then. And I almost missed my flight because I cleaned up blood all over the enclosure because he ripped one of his nails out on this carpet that I used before I knew better. Not only that, but it's a breeding ground for bacteria. So if you want to play it safe, slate is fine, pavers are fine, paper is fine as well. I recommend and I prefer a bioactive substrate or something more naturalistic. What I like to use for this, organic topsoil mixed with play sand, mixed with coconut coir, and then a little bit of sphagnum moss. Keeps it nice and fluffy, retains some moisture, but not too much because we'll talk about humidity. They don't like it very high. And if you're thinking, well, Adam, I read on a forum that that's going to give them impaction, they're going to die. No, that's not going to happen. Babies, okay, maybe play it safe and don't do this. When they're babies, I like to keep them on paper towel or newspaper or something like that because they have really small insides. But as adults, think about where they come from in the wild. They're going to have, Twix and rocks and all sorts of stuff that get mixed up with their food and digested. As long as they're hydrated, it'll go through their system and they'll be totally fine. Now, along with that, a lot of people recommend a water bowl. I recommend it too, but they're going to get most of their drinking done off of droplets of leaves. So spray them once a day. You're going to have a warm hide and a cool hide, but I recommend that on the warm side of the enclosure, you actually have 2. You have a dry hide and a moist hide. For moisture, just use sphagnum moss or something that holds humidity really well. You can use a sandwich container if you want, or something a little bit prettier. And then on the other side, the cool side, I recommend having a dry hide. For this animal, the cooler the environment, you don't want it to be very humid. They can get respiratory issues like that. And you want a gradient, which we'll talk about next in heat, lighting, and humidity. For heat, this is a really easy species. A lot of species, Uromastyx, savanna monitors, or Ackie monitors, those animals are going to need it really, really hot. These guys, they need it warmer than your house, but not by much. That gradient I was talking about, wherever you set up your cool end, you want it to be about 75 to 80 degrees Fahrenheit. On the warm side, it'll be 83 to 88 degrees Fahrenheit. Now keep in mind, these are ambient temperatures. These are not surface temperatures. This is air temperature that you're measuring. And if you get it a couple degrees off, you're totally fine. If your cool side is 73 degrees, your animal won't spontaneously combust. That's not what's going to happen. If it's 73 on the cool side, or even 70, or even 65 on the cool side, as long as they have a warm side where it's supposed to be, then they can just migrate over. They can choose that. They're not going to freeze above, if you get it down into the 50s, then, you have issues maybe. But even in their native range, it gets down pretty cool at night, some parts of the year and some parts of their range. And then for a basking spot, so you can accomplish this either overhead heat. I like to use an overhead lamp with a brick or something under it to catch the warmth. This is going to be around 93. I do between 92 and 98, depending on my enclosure. Some enclosures I have are bigger and have multiple hot spots. One might be 92, and then there might be one that's 95 or 98. For the humidity, this is highly variable. 20 to 40% is pretty standard. Up to 60% is okay. Once you get more than that as an ambient humidity in the enclosure, you're risking them having issues with their lungs. I prefer going around 40%. It's pretty close to what your house is going to be in most parts of the world. I mean, if you're in Miami or Niagara Falls, maybe not, but most places, it's going to be pretty close. Plus, you have those humid hides, so if they want to get somewhere where there is more humidity, they have that option. For lighting, make sure they have a day and night cycle. So this can be 12 hours of light, 12 hours of darkness, or 14 hours of light, and you know what I mean? It just depends what you want to do. I change mine through the year. Obviously, where they're from, they're closer to the equator than me, but just for all my reptiles, I have all my lights in the reptile room automatically go on when the sun comes up, and they automatically go off when the sun goes down. UVB, I recommend. I usually use, either if it's a tall enclosure, 6.0, because by the time it gets down to where they are, it's not going to be that strong. Or a 2.0 shade dweller. I wouldn't put too much stress on this. I know there's a lot of people out there now who are going above and beyond and will tell you if you don't use UVB, the monster will crawl out from under your bed and eat all your geckos. That will not happen, I promise you. You'll be completely fine without it, but I recommend it because if there's any sort of benefit, which, the jury's still out on scientifically, I'd rather just give it to them. If you're not aware, UVB is a spectrum of light. There's UVA, UVB, there's UVC too, but let's not get too complicated. This type of light comes from the sun and bulbs that you can buy. You hear that? They make squeaking sounds sometimes. It's pretty cool. That UVB helps synthesize vitamin D, which helps calcium production. Anyway, so it just makes their bones strong. That's it. Supplement your geckos correctly. We'll get to that at the end. And if you're looking for a spot to buy the substrate and the lighting and everything like that, I prefer going to chewy.com. There's a link below. There's literally a carousel, Wickens Wicked Habitats, that I helped them set up. And it shows all the things that I use for leopard geckos all in one spot. Your UVB is there. And Chewy doesn't do live animal sales like a bunch of other places that you might know of, which means there's no sketchy breeders or anything that they're associated with. Don't ever buy geckos from pet stores. It's such a bad idea. Big chain pet stores, that is. Chewy doesn't do that. Plus, they're a USARK Gold member, which means they give tons and tons of money to help us fight for our rights as reptile keepers. They're real reptile keepers. That's why I rock with Chewy. And if you want to save a bunch of money and get stuff shipped to your door, you should rock with Chewy too. Moving on to diet and supplementation. I'll be right off the bat. Supplementation is something that you need to do. Calcium, you need to supplement with D3 and without D3. Again, the link that I pointed you to has that there. And a multivitamin. The schedule is going to be different depending on the age of the gecko and the recommendation that you trust. This is the part of the video I'm going to tell you do more research. I can tell you what I do, but these are things that you should really look into yourself. Now, to understand when to supplement, you have to understand when to feed. And these animals, they only eat insects. I mean, sometimes they'll eat a pinky mouse once or then if you want to, if they're in breeding season or you just want to get them a little bit bigger, or as a tasty treat. But in general, staples, crickets, roaches, mealworms are a staple for me. Super worms, you can give them silkworms, you can give them hornworms. There's a whole bunch of things, but to me, roaches and crickets are the easiest. Plus, they're really easy to dust with their supplements. And what I like to do with supplements is every feeding I feed calcium without D3. Every other I feed with D3. And then once a week I feed with a multivitamin. Throw the crickets or whatever you're gonna feed in there, dust them up, swirl them around, and then feed your gecko. It's really easy. Imagine like shake and bake with chicken. It's kind of like that. As a feeding schedule, I like to feed babies appropriately sized insects, so the width between their eyes should be the largest width of an insect that you're going to feed them. I feed crickets usually and mealworms usually, and I feed babies every day. Once they hit about the 6 month to 1 year mark, I feed every other day or sometimes every third day, depending. And then as adults, I usually feed only twice a week or 3 times a week, depending. And usually I'll feed mealworms once, and then I'll feed crickets another time. And then sometimes I give treats, depending on when the season is. And I don't breed leopard geckos anymore, so I have no interest in getting females, ready for a breeding season. So unfortunately for Littlefoot here, actually who's never been bred, but for the rest of the females, I don't really give them too many treats anymore. And keep this fun, by the way. I know this is a lot of information. Keep it fun. These are really easy animals to keep. You'd have to really mess up in order to harm them. So just watch this video, do some reading, watch the video again if you want to, leave a comment, ask a question if you have one. Analysis paralysis is a real thing. Don't get too paralyzed with all the stuff that I'm telling you. It's really, really easy, I promise. Let's talk about behavior. These animals are very scary and so skittish and so apt to bite. Obviously, I'm kidding. This animal here, she'll kind of squawk at me or squeak or chirp. They have this cool, vocalization, let's say, which most geckos don't have. Tokay geckos entering the chat somewhere. The one thing I'll recommend, though, is never grab their tails. I mean, this animal is so used to me, I can kind of play with their tail and it's totally fine. But if you grab one of their tails, a defense mechanism that a lot of geckos and other species of lizard have is they'll detach the tail. The tail will detach, usually at the base, but it can be halfway through as well. And then it'll start wriggling around. It's just nerves doing it. They don't control it telepathically with their brain. And this is the predator that's trying to get them. All right, go get that thing that's wiggling around, and then the gecko will bolt the other direction. Now, this is stressful for them, but they'll grow it back. It'll be kind of ugly. It's not going to look normal. They're kind of called carrot tails sometimes, which is actually a morph as well, which we'll talk about right after this. Generally, when they're babies, sometimes they'll be a little cantankerous and defensive, and they'll kind of scream at you, which is adorable, and maybe they'll try to bite, but it will not hurt. It is absolutely not going to hurt you. It's not going to draw blood. You're going to live. As they become adults, almost always, they're super chill. And they're small, so if you put them on your shoulder, make sure you're on a very comfy couch or something like that, because if they fall, they're fragile and they might hurt themselves if they fall too far. And this is the part that's a little controversial about their behavior, is cohabiting. I could have included this with Enclosure. A lot of people will ask, if I want to get more than one, can I keep them together? And the safe answer is no. And you might have read and be thinking, well, this guy's crazy. Everything I've read always says no, never, ever, ever. That's just because we're trying to idiot-proof it, basically. We're trying to make it so that geckos and new people to geckos aren't going to get hurt. The geckos aren't going to get hurt because you don't know what you're doing and you're putting things together that shouldn't be together, and your feelings aren't going to get hurt as the keeper. In actuality, where they're from, in places like Pakistan, there's been papers written about this, they're never found alone. Ever. This isn't an exception. This is a rule. You will never, ever, ever find a leopard gecko out alone unless it's hunting, but then when it goes back to sleep, they are always in colonies. This is not debatable. This is fact. Now, does this mean you should keep them together? We don't have enough science to tell us yet, because there's certain animals, scorpion geckos are a great example of this, Cenodactylus, another type of gecko, not from the same part of the world, pretty similar, that we would usually never keep apart because they do better in colonies. Garter snakes, another great example. The reason that we tell you not to keep leopard geckos in colonies is because if you keep the wrong gecko with the wrong gecko, just like humans, sometimes they don't get along and then you have a gecko get hurt. This is really rare if you have the right setup. This is almost always caused by terrible setup or putting one really big gecko with one really small gecko or putting males together. You never, ever, ever want to put males together in the same enclosure. It is very likely they're going to fight. If you really want to keep females together, I did a video about it right here, and I do have an enclosure right beside me where I do have several leopard geckos in the same enclosure. The reason that it works is because there's 11 hides for 6 geckos. There's 9 or 10 hotspots. There's feeding sites. There's water sites for all of them. This enclosure, the way it is, has been like this unchanged for a year. I'm doing a full video about it next week. And I have another enclosure, almost the exact same setup, that has been together for years and years and years, and there has never ever been an issue ever. With that in mind, probably don't cohab unless you really know what you're doing. Lastly, price, availability, and morphs. This is the fantastic part about leopard geckos. If you want to get a rather normal looking leopard gecko or a base morph, something that only has a couple of genes or one gene, this is a Max No. She is heterozygous for Tremper, which means she carries an albinism gene, but actually doesn't show it herself. The same way that if your mom has brown eyes and your dad has blue eyes and you have blue eyes, your mom is heterozygous for blue eyes, even though she doesn't show it. This animal here would probably be between $50 and $80. I have some animals that I produce that are, $200 to $300. But most geckos, if you buy them at a source that is reasonable, it's why you don't buy them at PetSmart, because they're going to be $100 for a fancy leopard gecko, and it's going to be this animal or something even less expensive. They sell ball pythons for like $100. I mean, normal ball python should be $5 or $10. But if you buy it from a breeder or from an expo or from a reptile shop, then you're probably going to be spending around $50 for a regular or low-end gecko. And if you want a pet, that's all you need. If you want something crazy, there's geckos that are thousands of dollars. In terms of availability, you can find them at every reptile shop. You can find them at every reptile expo. There's lots of places online you can buy them from. Everybody and their brother breeds leopard geckos. It's really easy to find them. And in terms of morph, like I said before, there's certain ones that are really, really cheap, and then there are some that are really, really expensive. So it just depends what you want. I feel like we're not getting many new morphs of leopard geckos. A lot of people are getting into different locales and subspecies now. But in terms of morphs, there's really not that many that are over $1,000 anymore. And most of them are going to be, $100 to $500 that you can get really high-end morphs for $500 now. If you're someone who keeps leopard geckos now, write in the comment section below some advice for a new keeper. And if you're a new keeper, ask a question to me or somebody else and we can help you out. If you like videos like this, please hit like and subscribe. We're doing tons of care guides this year. I don't mean to, influence you to buy more reptiles, but you'll probably want to. And the Patreon supporters, thank you guys so much. Discounts on merch, the Sticks and Bricks merch, which is the enclosure over there. Videos early, discounts, and of course, one-on-one conversations. All that on Patreon for as little as $1 a month. Do videos twice a week. That means that me and Littlefoot will see you in the next one.